Hello everybody, before we dive into today's video, we're very happy to introduce one of our favorite sponsors to work with, the historic city of Quincy, Massachusetts. Ever wondered where the story of America's leadership took root? Quincy is that place. This city is home to the Adams National Historic Park, which preserves the home of President John Adams and John Quincy Adams, two of America's founding fathers. You can explore the birthplaces of these iconic leaders and walk the same halls as they once did, immersing yourselves in the beginnings of the United States. But Quincy isn't all about the past. It's a city that beautifully blends history with present-day adventures and experiences. From the iconic USS Salem to the stunning views of the Blue Hills and the architectural elegance of the Thomas Crane Library and Old City Hall, there's something here for everyone. And let's not forget the Epicurean delight that is Quincy's food scene. With an array of global and local flavors, it's a culinary journey that you can't miss. To discover more about what Quincy has in store for you, check out discoverquincy.com and step into history, and create some unforgettable memories while you're at it. Now let's get into today's video. Occasionally accused of being modern-day pyramids or monuments to someone's ego, presidential libraries have long been divisive institutions, especially when first established. However, while some have such perceptions of these libraries, it turns out there is vastly more to them than many people realize, and the more distant we become to the eras these leaders lived in, the more and more valuable the presidential libraries become to our understanding of history and our own evolution as a society, and as humans because of what they contain in an absolute treasure trove of materials, where it is not an exaggeration to say that a newly minted college graduate historian could enter a given presidential library one day, spend the next 5 decades of their career inside, and only scratch the surface of what that single library holds that no other institution in the world has. So what exactly are presidential libraries really? What do they contain? And how did this whole presidential library thing start in the first place? To begin with, while official presidential libraries are a relatively recent phenomenon, it is perhaps not surprising that the first presidential library of a sort was created by a man who religiously documented his life and the era he lived in his daily journal from the age of 12 all the way to his death at 80, and in so doing creating arguably one of the most studied diaries in history. Comprising over 15,000 very candid and self-critical pages, in it he occasionally gave first-hand accounts of countless historical events, not just in the US, but as he traveled across the globe in various courts, right down to his presence in France when Napoleon escaped from Elba and his analysis of the situation and of Napoleon himself. The man who wrote all of this and helped establish the antecedent to the modern presidential library was none other than the 6th President of the United States, John Quincy Adams. As to why he kept such a journal, at first, simply because his father told him to. He wrote, rather annoyed about the whole thing as a boy, "My papa enjoins it upon me to keep a journal or a diary of the events that happen to me and of the objects that I see and of characters that I converse with from day to day." As to why, the senior Adams put great stock in documenting the history that was happening all around them and wanted to instill the same in his son. In John Adams' case, his practice here was also extremely significant given he was one of the key architects of the American Revolution from its inception, helped negotiate the peace with Britain that ultimately granted insanely favorable terms for the new nation that helped it thrive immediately. He also wrote a couple works that helped define the US Constitution when the original Articles of Confederation proved to be the equivalent of a political dumpster fire that almost fractured the new nation into multiple independent nations right from the start. Let alone, of course, his time as George Washington's vice president and then serving as the 2nd president of the United States. His own complete journal, which did have some major gaps here and there, unlike his son's, ultimately comprised some 51 manuscripts covering much of his life starting in 1753 at the age of 18, and has likewise been well studied for his first-hand accounts and thoughts on a subset of major world events at the time, many of which he was at the epicenter of. And speaking of archiving things in major libraries, when signing the Act of Congress that moved the seat of the US government from Philadelphia to Washington, President John Adams also saw to it that $5,000, or about $90,000 today, was allocated for the establishment of a library for Congress in 1800, specifically stating it was for the purchase of such books as may be necessary for the use of Congress and for fitting up a suitable apartment for containing them. The initial library was fairly simple, containing just 740 works and a few maps. This all ultimately evolved over time into the incredible institution that is the Library of Congress, which today has an annual operating cost of about $800 million, housing almost 200 million items, rivaled in all of history only by the British Library in its size and scope of what it contains. Going back to John Quincy Adams, with his strong sense of the importance of accurately documenting the history of what was happening around him and leaving that to posterity, rather than do as some other presidents before him and leaving all their documents from their time in office and beyond to be divided up among their heirs, or even just neglected and ultimately lost or destroyed, Quincy Adams had a better idea, which he laid out in his will written on January the 18th, 1847, stating, "I give and bequeath my library of books, my manuscript books and papers, and those of my father and all my family pictures to my son, Charles Francis Adams, trusting that his mother shall at all times have the use of any of the books in the library at her discretions, and I recommend to my said son to cause a building to be erected, made fireproof, in which to keep the said library, books, documents, and manuscripts safe, and I especially recommend that he will, as far as he may be in his power, keep them together as one library." He further requested this library to be transmitted to his eldest son as one property to remain in the family and not to be sold or disposed of as long as may be practicable, being always confined to the faithful custody of the person holding the legal property in the same. And so it was that the stone library, made out of stone in order to be more resilient to fire, was established in 1870 by Charles Francis Adams, containing numerous personal papers and over 6,000 books his father had collected over his lifetime, along with thousands more from other family members through the years. In total, some 14,000 such works, including the famed Mendy Bible given to John Quincy Adams when he helped defend the Amistad captives before the U.S. Supreme Court. For more on this one, see our video, The True Story of the Amistad. Missing in this collection is around 3,500 books of John Adams's that included many thousands of notes in the margins written by Adams as he studied them, all ultimately given to the town of Quincy by Adams upon his death. Their journey from there, however, was rather interesting, including narrowly avoiding being destroyed by a fire and later by students. Finally, they were transferred to the Boston Public Library in 1894, where they have been maintained since and even fully digitized and available online now. The saga continues, however, with the city of Quincy for a while now wanting them back, but the Boston Public Library more or less going with a, how about not stance. More on this in the bonus facts later. But in any event, while incredibly small in scale compared to the vastly more grandiose official presidential libraries of today, the Stone Library, which can be visited at the Adams National Historical Park, was nonetheless based on the same idea, preserving for later generations as many primary documents and works about a given era and a given president as possible, all in one location for future people to study. Noteworthy on this one, given John Adams and John Quincy Adams' lives and all they accomplished, and pretty extreme importance to not just US history, but particularly with John Adams' world history through their work, in more recent times there has been a strong push, and indeed plans are well underway, to construct a modern presidential library, the Adams Presidential Center, for the Adams family in the next few years, including all that such institutions have to offer historians and the general public. On this, it's intended to be, to quote, a center for education, civic engagement, and discovery, all centered around the core values of the American citizenship first envisioned by the members of this extraordinary family whose contributions to our country are without equal but are often overlooked nationally. All brings us now to the more modern incarnation of the Presidential Library, what they are, and how it all got started. Enter Franklin D. Roosevelt. When FDR first became president in 1933, he found that the federal records were in a state of great disarray. He thus set about trying to fix the issue, and in 1934 signed the legislation which resulted in the creation of the National Archives, meant to oversee the preservation of the history of the nation. The nation's first archivist, Dr. R.D.W. Connor, stated of this that when he was appointed, FDR delivered a dissertation on the importance of the National Archives, both to the government and to scholars, pointed out some of its problems that required immediate attention, and assured me that I could rely on his continued interest in its development. You know, Roosevelt added, it's my baby. Fast forward a few years later, and FDR decided it was time to do something about the executive branch records as well, with all such documents accumulated during a given presidency at this point technically owned by the president. but what to do about it. This time enter Colonel Webb Hayes, son of President Rutherford B. Hayes. While other such libraries of a sort had existed, as previously illustrated, in more relatively recent times, Colonel Hayes decided to gift all of his father's documents and certain other materials to the Ohio State Archaeological and Historical Society, with various stipulations about what they'd do with him. The result of all of this was the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center, opened in 1916, something FDR, in 1938, would use as an inspiration for an even greater set of institutions he hoped to develop the first of, with Roosevelt admiring the fact that the Hayes Library was a veritable gold mine for historical scholars. Up until this point, as alluded to, most presidential papers and records had been scattered to the wind, many lost or destroyed, some sold, and even some where efforts had been made to preserve them, but amateurish by their owners and ultimately deteriorated to the point of uselessness as a result. On top of this, FDR noted that so often in the past, presidential papers and other public papers have been culled over during the lifetime of the owner, and the owner has thrown out a great deal of material which he personally did not consider of any importance, which, however, from the point of view of future history, may have been of the utmost importance. Thus, FDR wanted to try to change all this, calling together a group of historians in 1938 to get their thoughts on the matter and how he intended to fix it. As to what they came up with, Professor Samuel Morrison of Harvard noted, President Roosevelt has proposed for the first time to keep all of his files intact and to place them immediately under the administration of the National Archives so that they will be under public control and will not be subject to dilapidation and destruction. The whole thing will come down in its entirety to the historians of the future. Roosevelt would expand on this publicly on December 10, 1938, when announcing his intention to the nation. For the last 2 years, I have been considering more and more the final disposal of what amounts to probably the largest collection of original source material of almost anybody over the last quarter of a century. Because these papers relate to so many periods and activities which are not connected with my service in the federal government, I do not wish to break them up, leaving a portion of them to the National Archives and dividing the rest. It is my desire that they be kept as a whole and intact in their original condition, available to scholars of the future in one definite locality. Not just for the future, FDR also hoped all of this would be beneficial to his current generation as well, in particular given the rise of governments in certain parts of the world that, let's just say, were not exactly doing good things. He felt making the government more open and transparent in its doings couldn't hurt. Thus, the Presidential Library, with all the documents from his administration being almost completely open to the public, would help facilitate more trust, not just for his administration, but hopefully in setting the precedent beyond for all future presidents. He stated at the opening of his library, "This latest addition to the Archives of America is dedicated at a moment when government of the people by themselves is being attacked everywhere. It is therefore proof, if any proof is needed, that our confidence in the future of democracy has not diminished in this nation and will not diminish." He would later note, most critically of all in his dedication of his library on June 30th, 1941, "A nation must believe in three things. It must believe in the past, it must believe in the future, it must, above all, believe in the capacity of its own people to learn from the past that they can gain in judgment in creating their own future." To aid towards this end, he not only, as mentioned, donated all the papers accumulated throughout his presidency, but also donated a portion of his family property in Hyde Park for the building to be built on. Going back to his papers, these were not just from himself and his administration, but also the over 4,000 letters per day he received from the general public, something Roosevelt regularly encouraged and seemingly valued highly. He stated this on November 19th, 1939, "Of the papers which will come to rest here, I personally attach less importance to the documents of those who have occupied high public or private office than I do the spontaneous letters which have come to me and my family and my associates from men, from women, and from children in every part of the United States, telling me of their conditions and problems and giving me their opinions." In this way, it also made the archives here a valuable asset for future historians about many of the general public's thoughts and opinions on matters, not just those of the administration. All of this, he also set the precedent of the initial libraries to be created via public donations rather than by taxpayer money. But then once finished, the entire library and all it contained would be turned over to the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, to maintain from there. Of course, immediately the critics came out of the woodworks. For example, after the July 18, 1939 bill authorizing the government to receive and maintain FDR's library was passed, 231 to 124, one of the members of the opposition noted, "Only an egocentric maniac would have the nerve to ask for such a measure." And many others chimed in that it was a modern-day pyramid, a sentiment oft-repeated, such as in one 1971 Washington Post cartoon by famed cartoonist and author Herb Block, depicting Lyndon B. Johnson as an Egyptian pharaoh next to his new presidential library in Texas with the title, The Great Pyramid of Austin. This is an analogy frequently leveled against presidential libraries from the beginning and since by reporters and others who apparently do not possess an ounce of originality or understanding of what a presidential library actually is. Or conversely, maybe don't understand what the pyramids were. Either way, they should look into it before opening their mouths. Everybody knows the pyramids were interstellar transport devices, not remotely like a presidential library. Despite the critics, FDR soldiered on and, in the end, the project was pushed forward. So important to the president was the library that the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, on December the 8th, 1941, FDR not only delivered his famed speech on the matter, and the US shortly after declared war on Japan, but also sought a meeting with the administrators of his library, which had been opened about 5 months before this, writing that day, "Memorandum for General Watson. If things are not too hectic next week, I would like to have the trustees of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library to lunch at the White House. Will you arrange it?" In the beginning, however, the library was nothing special, with initial displays simply being various items of Roosevelt, such as his ship collection, artwork, and various other things related to the president, all something that did not exactly help with the critics who felt it was just a monument to FDR's ego. However, the delay in the real vision of the library as an archive was simply because FDR was still actively president and he had intended to sort through all of his papers himself once he retired from office. Although even then there would have been significant delay, as the processing of all the documents for later public consumption is something that takes many, many years, and in some instances decades to complete, even for a team of individuals. Matters were further delayed in this case after FDR's sudden death while in office on April 12, 1945, and it had to be determined whether the government really did legally own all his documents in the collection or not, as he has stated was his wish, with all this taking about 3 years to affirm. On top of this, there was quite the lengthy legal battle over when and what documents should be publicly available or not just restricting some for security purposes, but also guarding the personal privacy of some individuals still living. After all, if you wrote a personal letter to Roosevelt while president meant for his eyes only, but was then donated as a part of all his records, you may wish that that letter be expunged from public access in his library, or at least until after you die. After all of this was reasonably sorted, the other half of FDR's vision for his library was put into place when, on March 17, 1950, with about 85% of the various materials having been processed at this point, most of these were made available to anyone who wanted to come look through them. Later, another 2 million or so more documents and other items were added to the library upon Eleanor Roosevelt's death in 1962, and today the library has over 17 million documents. The result of all of this is an unparalleled repository of primary documents concerning the executive administration of the US government from the New Deal all the way through World War II, and then quite a bit beyond in Eleanor Roosevelt's editions covering the 17 years or so after. In all, by 1976, only 0.5% of the library's assets were held back from public consumption, a percentage that has actually gone down considerably since, as elements of national security and privacy of individuals of the remaining have become mostly irrelevant with time. In the end, this created something of a relatively unique institution that was a hybrid of a museum and an archive. On this, classically, for most of the history of museums as institutions, they were indeed places for scholars to flock and study. But over the years, most museums shifted to be places primarily for the general public to learn via exhibits and the like, but of relatively little interest to the experts in a given field. The presidential libraries as they function, however, still do both. A place for scholars, journalists, and amateur historians to come and study in the archives, and a place for the general public to learn on the front-facing side in the museums. And while the archive component of them is often deemed the most critical aspect of these institutions by many, it's noted that for every every one person to visit the library to sift through the archives, about 100 visit to simply see the exhibits on the museum side, with a total of roughly a couple million people per year visiting the official presidential libraries and learning about these various segments of US history from the individuals who actually helped shape them. Of course, one library is nice, and certainly covering the era of the Great Depression through World War II is very significant, but FDR hoped to inspire all presidents after him to do the same for all time, which is more or less exactly what has happened so far. First, his successor in Harry Truman ultimately announced his intention to have such a library built, stating on May the 8th, 1954, "My papers will be the property of the people and be accessible to them, and this is as it should be. The papers of the president are among the most valuable sources of material for history. They ought to be preserved and they ought to be used." Thus, with Truman's encouragement, this all inspired Congress to pass the Presidential Libraries Act of 1955 to formalize the process and, in turn, encourage all presidents from this point on to donate their various materials. Every single president from this point, with the exception so far of Donald Trump, has had a presidential library facility constructed or currently in construction, as is the case with the Barack Obama Presidential Center, which is unique in a variety of ways and will probably set the precedent for a new model of presidential library going forward, as we'll get into in a bit. On this note, over the years, there have been some notable changes to the official presidential library system. For example, thanks to President Nixon and his propensity to destroy or not want to give up certain records from his presidency, starting in 1974 with the Presidential Recordings and Materials Preservation Act, things began to change markedly. In this one, it required, among other things, that any materials related to Watergate and abuse of government power be processed and released before any other presidential materials. It also gave legal authority for the National Archives to process and then retain those records which are relevant to such abuses of power, and then return the rest to the president as his personal property. Again, partially inspired by Nixon's antics, the Presidential Records Act of 1978 changed things even more. From Hoover to Carter, between these, all the presidents, with slight exception in Nixon as noted, followed the deed of gift model, allowing them to determine access to their documents and what they gave or didn't give. In a nutshell, the papers technically belonged to the president and they got to determine what to do with them. After the Presidential Records Act of 1978, from Ronald Reagan on, all documents received by or created by the president as a part of their duties as president now belong to the government and are mandated to be publicly accessible via the Freedom of Information Act starting 5 years after the end of the president's term, though there are still some exceptions where the president has a right to restrict access to some types of records for up to 12 years. It's also noteworthy that the presidents are encouraged, though of course not required, to donate further materials related to their pre- and post-presidential lives as well. This act also established a well-defined structure to how all of these records now needed managed while in office and after, something that hasn't generally been a problem since, except with the Trump administration where, similar to Nixon, destroying and discarding certain records while in office, according to the National Archives, was a bit of an issue, with NARA employees having to try to put back together or recover torn up or sometimes even flushed documents, as well as the Trump administration delaying providing certain materials to them. But today, as noted, every president from Hoover on, with the exception of President Trump so far, has had constructed a presidential library building, and their value as historical archives cannot be understated. Of the current 15 such institutions, note Trump's records held by NARA are included here, despite no plans for an official building yet, contain over 500 million pages of text, over 20 million photos, another 20 million or so feet of film, over 100,000 hours of audio and video recordings beyond this, another 500 terabytes of digital data, and close to 1 million significant objects from family heirlooms to gifts given to the president during their time in office. Going back to the audio and video recordings, these are everything from family tapes to even oral memoirs from those within the administration, family, and friends of the president, giving their perspectives and insight into things after the fact for posterity. And as for the documents, these include everything from the presidential daily diary, which is an official record of basically every second of what they got up to that day and with whom, to their own correspondence and internal documentation of basically every decision made, as well as various people in the administration thoughts, to even, as noted in the FDR example, letters from regular American citizens about this or that. The vast majority of all of this is available to be read at anyone's leisure who wishes to go to the libraries, or more and more in modern times, some of it being digitized and available online for perusal. But as alluded to, it generally takes a significant amount of time from when a president leaves office to when much of their records become available, just from the sheer scope of trying to organize it all, as well as that you need individuals with high security clearance to sort through what can be publicly available at a given time or not. On top of this, 5 years after the president leaves office, archivists report that from that point on, they are pretty much always drowning in processing Freedom of Information Act requests as well, further delaying finishing processing everything else. Thus, even in some rather old presidential libraries, processing of documents to sort what can be publicly available or not, let alone digitizing and organizing, is still an ongoing task. Archivist Alan Weinstein notes of their efforts to make everything digital, however, this is an important step for the National Archives to achieve its goal of becoming an archive without walls. Our new strategic plan emphasizes the importance of providing access to records anytime, anywhere. This brings us to former President Barack Obama's library, which is something of a potential new model for future presidents to follow, reflecting both the changing times and technologies, as well as how certain rules in recent decades have made making an official presidential library obscenely expensive. So what changes did he make? First, his presidential center is not technically an official presidential library, though in practice will function as one little different than the official ones, albeit without the federal funding. This choice was made in order to significantly reduce cost. In this, rather than store the archives on site and all the extreme expense that entails, the entire archive will be digitized and unclassified elements made available to the public online via NARA. The physical materials themselves will then be stored and maintained at a NARA facility at their discretion and expense, which is technically the real Barack Obama Presidential Library, though not a place any but the archivists are likely to ever visit. Noteworthy on the digitizing efforts, NARA states that about 95% of the records from the Obama administration were already digital anyway, though the 5% remaining still comprise some 30 million pages of paper records that need to be put in digital form. And as for the public face of the Barack Obama Presidential Library Center in the museum, any physical materials for exhibits and the like possessed by NARA can be legally lent to any institution they want, including Obama's Presidential Center, which is owned by the city of Chicago. And the plan is to do exactly this for the museum for their exhibits. Thus, in practice, the Barack Obama Presidential Center will function little different than any presidential library of the past, just with all the unclassified records not just available at the center's computers, but online anywhere in the world. In some respects, morphing the Presidential Center from an archive and museum combined to two separate facilities in the NARA-maintained archives available anywhere in the world one has internet access, and the Presidential Center itself from the museum side. Thus, in practice, the Barack Obama Presidential Center will function little different than any presidential library of the past, just with all the unclassified records not just available at the center's computers, but online anywhere in the world. In some respects, morphing the Presidential Center from an archive and museum combined to two separate facilities in the NARA-maintained archive available anywhere in the world one has internet access, and the Presidential Center itself for the museum side. NARA notes this is likely to be the path most presidents in the future take as alluded to, building a library that adheres to the various rules today requires a pretty extreme amount of money, including now an endowment to NARA proportional to the size of the facility to help offset operation costs. Noteworthy, Obama also made another slight change from many other presidents in releasing the names of any donor over $200 and not allowing any donations from foreign nationals, in part as a response to the controversy of George H.W. Bush's library having received significant donations from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Speaking of controversy, while few would argue there isn't extreme historical value in the archives, many see little such value in the museum side, particularly as the exhibit side occasionally reflects strong biases towards painting the president whose name graces the title of their institutions in a favorable light. Perhaps the most extreme example of this was Nixon's library, which originally, for the record, operated outside of the official system up until relatively recently, even once having an exhibit about Nixon's leaving office literally stating it was the result of a coup. Nevertheless, FDR and others argued that the museum side was just as important as the archives. Again, for every 100 people that visit these institutions, only one is someone looking to research something. The rest are coming to learn about this history directly via the exhibits, and many of these would not otherwise read or consume perhaps even any of the works created by the historians and others doing research there. The museum itself is the vehicle for many to learn about these portions of history and the significant events that occurred and why. Then there is just encouraging people to come to learn in the first place. As FDR said when asked why he allocated so much space to exhibits when the institution was largely meant as an archive, well, you know, if people have to pay a quarter to get into the library, they'll want to see something interesting inside. Of course, this only works if what's in the exhibits accurately reflects the facts and context of a given thing in history. So do they? Well, it's complicated. To begin with, even in the official NARA-administrated presidential libraries, the government does not really get a say on exhibits shown on the museum side, other than NARA noting they do push the museums to be as apolitical as possible. While at first glance, this may seem the wrong way to do things, not exactly being standardized, some might argue that making sure the government does not have much of a say here in the long term probably helps ensure history is more accurately reflected as it was, instead of what a current government might want to portray. That said, most presidential libraries, starting out privately funded and their operations still requiring significant donations over time beyond the federal funding, absolutely do tend to reflect strong biases, especially in the beginning. However, given they are institutions for the centuries and not just for today, it turns out this isn't really a major problem long term and has been illustrated well in the current set of libraries. As the years from a given president's time in office and life pass, the trend is for a much more holistic view of a given administration, good and bad, as is always reflected in the archives themselves for researchers. A classic example of this is that while Hoover, president from 1929 to 1933, was still alive, the museum side of his library made no mention at all of the Great Depression. After his death in 1964, however, they began covering it in exhibits and what the Hoover administration tried to accomplish to counter it and the failures and successes there. As another example, while the Truman Library initially exhibited similar biases to only show Truman and his administration in a favorable light, today they actually have contrasting exhibits in their renovated exhibit halls showing both the originals as well as right next to them a dissenting view exhibit. Similarly, the Johnson Library once largely avoided exhibiting anything to do with the Vietnam War in its museum, but now cover it and try to provide historical context for the war and events, as well as decisions made, and in all, otherwise trying to stay fairly neutral on it now. President Carter, as ever, seems to have broken the mold on all of this, and we'll get into more of the extreme significance of his library shortly. But for now, from the beginning, the curators of his museum were, at the encouragement of Carter, happy to show issues during his administration pretty unabashedly and impartially, even seemingly making a concerted effort to do so. But regardless, while it's impossible to get rid of all biases and almost all presidential libraries exhibit some in their exhibits to start, over time, the trend is very strongly towards apolitical and providing accurate context by the curators, with the controversy from here tending to lie more just with the constant battle between the curators and the archivists over preserving the materials they have or making them available for the general public to see or even interact with in exhibits. Of course, some presidential libraries, or at least their associated institutions, have even more of a benefit beyond tourism for a given location, historical study, museums to bring to life some part of history in an interesting way for the general public to learn from and the like, but also a major boon to current society. Perhaps there is no greater example of this than the combined facilities created by Jimmy Carter. Carter was notably very sour on the idea of his own presidential library, vehemently stating to his wife, Rosalind, he didn't want a monument to myself. Things only got worse when he saw some initial architectural ideas on it, with Rosalind stating after he saw the initial design proposals, one was like a temple looming toward the sky, which, as the architect said, could be seen from anywhere in Atlanta. Jimmy was adamant in his opposition. I could see the vein in his temple throbbing. That night on the way to our mountain cabin, Jimmy said, "I'm not going to have a library." At the time, he meant it. However, she goes on that later he awoke from a dream and had an epiphany, stating, "I know what we can do with the library. We can have a place to resolve conflict." And that, for the first time since our return to Plains, I saw Jimmy really excited about possible plans for the future. And that's exactly what he did, creating the Carter Center in a shared building adjacent to his presidential library, with the library, as other official presidential libraries, operated by the government, and the Carter Center portion operated by a not-for-profit organization founded by Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, and in partnership with Emory University. Thrust of all of this, and an emphasis for his library's museum, is on promoting peace, human rights, and physical and mental health. Carter, a Democrat, also wanted all of this completely nonpartisan, even working on some of the early programs in it with former President Gerald Ford, a Republican. In the interim, from then to now, the center has worked on all sorts of issues facing the world, from trying to combat diseases, promoting immunization, various mental health programs, and just trying to reduce the stigma surrounding seeking help for mental illness in the first place, to helping to facilitate peace between various opposing warring entities. The list goes on, while the Associated Library ultimately also covers some of this and efforts in all of it in their exhibits and with the records donated by Carter. As for a few specifics, this included spearheading the eradication of guinea worm disease, which was affecting millions annually at the time the Carter Center decided to focus on it in 1986. Today, only a couple dozen cases per year occur worldwide, making it very close to being the first ever parasitic disease to be eradicated. The organization also helped broker ceasefires and peace several times, such as helping to negotiate the Nairobi Agreement between Sudan and Uganda in 1999. From all of this, in 2002, Carter was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his work to find peaceful solutions to international conflicts, to advance democracy and human rights, and to promote economic and social development. He outlined in his acceptance speech the focus of his work and organization. Among all the possible choices, I decided that the most serious and universal problem is the growing chasm between the richest and poorest people on Earth. Citizens of the 10 wealthiest countries are now 75 times richer than those who live in the 10 poorest ones, and the separation is increasing every year, not only between nations, but also within them. The results of this disparity are root causes of most of the world's unresolved problems, including starvation, illiteracy, environmental degradation, violent conflict, and unnecessary illnesses that range from guinea worm to AIDS. Tragically, in the industrialized world, there is a terrible absence of understanding or concern about those who are enduring lives of despair and hopelessness. We have not yet made the commitment to share with others an appreciable part of our excess wealth. This is a necessary and potentially rewarding burden that we should all be willing to assume. In all of this, his life after the presidency has been insanely productive, perhaps the only president to date to rival John Quincy Adams to have his post-presidency life rival or even exceed the importance of what he did as president. For the story on that one, see our video, The Horribly Dressed, Socially Awkward Genius President. Now, given Carter's illustrated rather broad latitude of his library and the associated independent Carter Center sharing the grounds, if you're now wondering about the general process here of the creation of the libraries today, well, keep watching because that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. Because the institutions are still privately funded by the donations for their creation, as was the case in FDR's presidential library, the presidents themselves have huge latitude to make of them what they will, and from architecture to location to various internal facets of their purpose beyond historical centers, most presidents put their own spin on them and have them reflect their personalities to an extent as well. This, of course, aids in the argument that they are just monuments to presidents' egos, but notably, as with Carter, this reflection isn't generally a bad thing. As for location, in the early going of all of this, presidents had a tendency to pick the locations that were important to them, and the trend was often more rural and out of the way, even occasionally built on their own properties they donate to the government in this way. However, this was not without controversy. For example, FDR's mom was opposed to giving up some of their land for such an institution. Truman's family likewise didn't appreciate using part of the farm for this. JFK's initially picked site near Harvard resulted in lawsuits over it, significantly delaying construction, with the general fear being of, to quote, hordes of tourists, automobiles, fast food franchises, and souvenir shops all clogging the narrow streets as a result. After several years of controversy and protests, a separate site was selected in Massachusetts than the one Kennedy himself had chosen before his death. Speaking of Kennedy wanting to build his library next to a major university, in recent years there's been a marked move away from more rural locations, as having such institutions so far away from large populaces partially killed one of the points of being readily accessible to the general public. Further, by locating the library next to or within a university's ground, it also allowed for easy access by historians and students at that university to come study the records as well. While the first to make such a change would have been Kennedy, if not for the controversy of location and other such delays. Lacking such controversy, his successor in Lyndon B. Johnson succeeded here first, having his library built in Austin, Texas, located on the grounds of the University of Texas at Austin. One of Johnson's staff members also noted of the choice that Johnson used to say, "I don't believe that all the brains of the country are at Stanford or Harvard. I think that there are brains in the middle of the country, but I find that when I'm appointing people, that's where I'm going to find qualified candidates." Johnson's wife Claudia would note of this, they felt locating the library at the university would help it be a living thing that will be of use to a lot of young people who might want to learn about public services and governmental activities, thus hopefully getting more people inspired into careers in government and thus more highly qualified candidates towards this end from this region as well. Beyond all this, as mentioned, the presidential libraries are first funded by donations from the public to get them built in the first place, and then afterwards, while donations and outside funding in various ways is the norm and essential, along with in more recent times a required endowment to NARA based on square footage of the building, it and its administration ultimately falls in part under the Office of Presidential Libraries within NARA. Noteworthy here, because of all the red tape and rules, even with dangling the potential federal funds, there are currently more presidential libraries that aren't official than are at 15 official ones versus 16 outside. And even here, the numbers actually skew slightly further in that the Trump and Obama libraries are technically included in that 15, but for Trump, once again, there are no plans for a building yet outside of the NARA facility storing his records, and Obama's is, as noted, a bit of a hybrid. As to the others, they include ones like the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, which is operated by the state of Illinois. With all of these, they are generally funded by a combination of the public who visit them, as well as donations from various individuals and state or city funding from the region where they reside, rather than going with federal funding, as with the NARA-operated libraries. This all brings us to the federal funding side of things. This is something quite controversial for some, though again, this depends on your perspective of the value of these libraries. As museums and monuments to a given president, perhaps overvalued, though educating the populace on its history in an engaging way has extreme intangible value, and certainly every school the world over appreciates this and makes a concerted effort to teach such history, albeit generally in the most boring way humanly possible, often making the figures in history mythical and unrelatable, or otherwise whittling it all down to hard facts like names, dates, and events, rather than really diving into the richness and nuance and context of it all, and most critically of all, putting in the human element and the real personalities of those involved. From movies to books to even just telling a friend an interesting anecdote, no story is interesting without good, relatable characters. History has these quite literally in every significant event that has occurred since humans have been humaning. The individuals who were involved and helped shape history are there, but the way history is taught in schools tends to take all of this out, or at least make these figures involved completely unrelatable, removing the human side of who they really were. Put the human element back in and really illustrate with their own words and accounts and the accounts of the people who knew them, their thoughts and ideas and mistakes and personal struggles and self-doubt. Now you have an interesting and engaging story people will not only pay attention to, but be fascinated by and remember later. And most importantly, really learn something from. As a brief aside, an example on this, normally in studying someone like Napoleon in a traditional history class, you'll walk away with the impression of some mythical general and in all, completely unrelatable. But if you really want to be ultra engaged on the man himself, go read the countless letters between himself and his ex-wife, Josephine, who he left because of her inability to have children, but the pair's relationship remained extremely strong throughout his life, all the way to when he was held at Elba and his wife refused to join him, but Josephine begged to do so, writing him, "Ah, sire, why can I not fly to you? Why can I not give you the assurance that exile has no terrors save for vulgar minds, and that, far from diminishing a sincere attachment, misfortune imparts to it new force? I have been on the point of quitting France to follow your footsteps and to consecrate to you the remainder of an existence which you so long embellished. A single motive restrained me, and that you may divine. If I learn that, contrary to all appearance, I am the only one who will fulfill her duty, nothing shall detain me, and I will go to the only place where henceforth there can be happiness for me, since I shall be able to console you when you are there isolated and unfortunate. Say but the word, and I depart. Adieu, sire, whatever I would add would still be too little. It is no longer by words that my sentiments for you are to be proved, and for actions your consent is necessary. Unfortunately for the pair, she died quite suddenly not long after sending this. But in those letters between the couple, you'll see an extremely human and vulnerable side of the man rarely illustrated in history classes. The real, flawed, and occasionally uncertain human like all of us. For a very small taste of this, see our video, Pomp and Circumstance and the Trouble with Heirs. Similarly, if you learn about John and John Quincy Adams in a history class, you'll typically learn a lot of significant events they were involved with and their work, but if you really want to be fascinated and get so much better context on the events they were involved in and decisions being made, learn about the very real humans by going and reading some of the literally thousands of letters exchanged between themselves and their wives. Or likewise, read the insane number of letters between John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Abigail Adams over the years to really get an incredible view of this trio who all went from almost family and affection to bitter enemies for many years to the closest of friends once again in the end, with some of their last thoughts seemingly of each other. See our Quincy documentary series playlist for more on all of this and to really get to know all of these very real individuals who helped shape history, as well as one of the most colorful and hilarious of them all in Ben Franklin. In all, it is in these personal correspondence and similar personal records that the real humans come to life, and that's what engages people to learn about our collective history and learn better context of all of it. Like any story, really getting to know the characters involved and their personalities and flaws and thoughts are what is essential. In the entertainment world, a movie can be good on the strength of mostly the characters alone, even if the story is mediocre. But it's extremely rare to find a movie that people really engage with and enjoy that has even a really great story, but no real characters anyone cares about, often owing to being either underdeveloped or unrelatable. The same is true with history. Again, it does not matter how interesting or significant the story. You need the relatable, fully fleshed out characters, something most history textbook writers seem to have missed the memo on. This is where, at their best, the presidential libraries on their public face shine and where their value as museums is illustrated, with exhibits featuring many primary documents and artifacts that really get people to know the individual personally and their thoughts, personal struggles, personality quirks, family, and even mistakes as they help shape world history. Done right in such exhibits, these individuals become relatable, flawed, and very real humans like the rest of us, and that is the hook that will get people interested in the broader story surrounding these individuals and help people to truly understand the context of everything involved, as well as a good glimpse into the world these people were living in. Going back to the value of the libraries in general, this is not to mention the extreme value for researchers in the archives themselves. Some would argue that is priceless. This brings us to how much all of this actually costs. About $100 million annually. For a slight comparison, this is about 1/8 the cost of the Library of Congress. This is also a drop in the bucket to the US's over $6 trillion spent every year. For a further reference, the entire budget to maintain all official presidential libraries today for 1 year is the sticker price of one single F-35 fighter, of which the US currently has almost 500 of and plans to purchase close to 2,000 more. Further, the operating cost of these planes beyond the sticker price is about $40,000 per hour, and the total cost of the entire F-35 program is estimated to be enough to operate all the current official presidential libraries for about 17,000 years. Yep. While we're not here to argue for wasting money, regardless of how much the government spends elsewhere, let's just say, as cool of a piece of technology as the F-35 plane is, and as an avid aviation enthusiast and pilot, see our sister channel Higher Learning, nobody appreciates amazing planes more, but the F-35's importance is a drop in the bucket next to the historic and learning center value found in the presidential libraries. And many have even argued the F-35's importance to even today is basically non-existent, with the argument generally going that while it is an extremely versatile fighter and incredible piece of technology, nearly unmatched in the air given the countless types of missions it's well suited for, Well, almost every single one of them can be accomplished by other existing hardware at sometimes an absolute minuscule fraction of the cost, rather than going with the Swiss Army knife that is the F-35. Regardless of your opinion there, long after the F-35 is an antiquated piece of technology with only a handful of examples still existing in museums, if at all, historians and the general public will still have access to the rich history from the primary documents the presidential libraries hold, and all the stories they tell about who we were, why we did what we did at a given period of time, and how we got from there to whatever present-day state we find ourselves in as a nation, and someday, when the United States has gone the way of the dodo, as a species. In the end, previous generations before the presidential libraries had a tendency to have built other monuments to the leaders of the nation, such as Mount Rushmore. However, presidential libraries essentially accomplished the same exact thing, but in a much more historically significant way. As Ada Louise Huxtable of the New York Times noted upon the opening of the Lyndon B. Johnson Library, the age of Lincoln and Jefferson memorials is over. It will be presidential libraries from now on. And on this note, while the critics may be correct that the libraries are, in a sense, a monument to each of the former leaders of the United States, with some level of bias in their public face, especially in the beginning, they are unequivocally also unparalleled institutions for the study of these eras and the decisions made in them and why, as well as the deep thoughts of the people involved. As the first chair of the FDR Library Executive Committee would sum up, many will use these documents. Some will seek only to support one or the other side of controversies, to attack or to defend, to magnify or to belittle, and such users will be too often content to lift passages from their context and to distort their meaning. But the use of these collections to add value and enduring knowledge will be the work of those who, competent in the patient and careful methods of research, have one purpose only: to know the truth. Now how about a bonus fact? Going back to the 3,500 or so books of John Adams originally given to the city of Quincy, the collection bounced around over the years from the family home to Quincy City Hall, where they were almost destroyed by a fire. After this, they went to the Adams Academy, where they were used and abused by students there who had little respect for their historic significance, using them like they would any book from any other library. After a bit of damage here, they went back to City Hall, then to the Evangelical Congregational Church, and next to the Thomas Crane Memorial Hall, where the collection sat for a decade with little fanfare and few visitors coming to look over it. With little interest here at this point, finally the collection was transferred to the Boston Public Library in 1894. As noted, today the city of Quincy wants them back for their upcoming Adams Presidential Center, but the Boston Public Library is kind of like, nah, I think we'll keep them. Presumably in no small part because while little fanfare was given to the books back in the late 19th century, today they are highly sought and, for example, over 60,000 people came to see them in 2006 as a part of the John Adams Unbound exhibit. Noteworthy, among these books are works Adams consulted while drafting the momentous Massachusetts Constitution, which was a partial inspiration for the US Constitution, legal texts he used while defending the soldiers who were a part of the Boston Massacre, and further, within these texts are, as mentioned, thousands of annotations written in the margins by John Adams himself while studying them. So what do you think, dear viewers? Who should have them? The Boston Public Library's argument for keeping them is seemingly that they've maintained them for over a century, even digitizing them all relatively recently, if you'd like to go look them over online. Without this and all the costs that went with it, the books would be next to worthless today. Thus, they've possessed them and taken care of them for ages. At this point, legal ownership should be theirs. The city of Quincy's argument is that they were literally given to the city by Adams himself, and while perhaps they didn't always have a great place to keep them back before they were transferred to the Boston Public Library for safekeeping, they soon will with the Adams Presidential Center, which would, of course, being the new world center of all things Adams family once it's open, like to collect anything and everything out there in terms of primary artifacts and works related to the Adams, especially ones that they, seemingly already own. So what do you think, dear viewer? Who should have them? Or what sort of compromise would seem suitable here? Inquiring minds want to know.